At the center, we provide the members of the Smith School community with skills in international business, opportunities to gain a global mindset, and to serve as a Maryland resource center for companies with global operations. The center is also one of 15 nationally recognized centers across the country to have been awarded a Title VI grant known as SIBE or Cyber. And the SIBE grant is administered by the U.S. Department of Education, supports many of our activities, including the event here this evening, and it expands our mission outside the campus to industry and other academic institutions. Tonight, we welcome you to the center's 4th annual forum. This is a springtime event that brings together distinguished voices from the academic, policy, diplomatic, and business communities to speak on a different theme each year. And I'm honored to give a special welcome to our speaker this evening, Dr. Marcus Brunnermeier, joining us via Zoom, and to the center's academic director, Dr. Kisleya Prasad, who will take us into a discussion over the next hour after I finish a few opening comments. So I'd like to share a few tips to help us move smoothly through the next hour. Following the discussion, we will open up the conversation to questions from the audience. For those joining us via Zoom, please feel free to send your questions through the Q&A function in the bottom of your screen. For you all here joining us in person, please approach the microphone here in the middle aisle to ask your question. If you're an undergraduate student seeking iSmith credit, there will be a QR code that will come up on the screen towards the end of the event. So be sure to scan that to get your credit. Virtual participants will see a link when the event closes to take our 2-minute survey about the event, and you all have that evaluation at your seats. So with that said, it's now my pleasure to introduce our speakers this evening. Dr. Marcus Brunnermeier is the author of The Resilient Society, the book of which you all received a copy of this evening, and it also has his autograph in the front part of the book. Dr. Brunnermeier is the Edwards S. Sanford Professor in the Economics Department at Princeton University and Director of Princeton's Bendheim Center for Finance. I'd like to now turn the event over to Dr. Kisleya Prasad, Academic Director of the Center and Research Professor here at the Smith School. Dr. Prasad will introduce Dr. Brunnermeier further and also the book, The Resilient Society. Please welcome our speakers.
Thank you, Marina. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this event. Thank you for coming. So we are privileged to have with us today Marcus Brunnermeier. Marcus is the Edward S. Sanford Professor in the Economics Department at Princeton University and Director of Princeton's Bendheim Center for Finance. He's a Fellow of the Econometric Society, a Guggenheim Fellow, a Sloan Research Fellow, a Vice President of the American Finance Association, and a non-resident Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute. His research focuses on international financial markets and the macroeconomy, with special emphasis on bubbles, liquidity, financial and monetary price stability, and also digital money. So the topic of today's talk is the book that you've all received, The Resilient Society. The book's won many awards. It won the prize for the 2021 Best Business Book in German and was among the best books on the best books list of the Financial Times. So to introduce the book, I can't do better than read from a couple of the blurbs at the back of the book. So Angus Deaton, the 2015 Nobel laureate in economics, writes, Marcus Brunnermeier has written a landmark book on resilience. It is an indispensable guide to what we must learn from the pandemic and how to do better next time. Robert Shiller, the 2013 Nobel laureate, writes, in this book, Marcus Brunnermeier thinks big about the long-term future in light of the lessons we have learned from the recent transforming events. His book is a significant read for anyone taking a leadership role in the coming years. My own feeling reading the book was that it makes you think about lots of things in new and different ways. And so I found it incredibly stimulating. All of you have a copy, and I think you're going to have a fantastic time with it today, reading the book. So our plan for today is first, Dr. Brunnermeier will give a short presentation. After that, I'll get to ask some questions, and then we'll open up to the audience, and all of you will be able to ask questions. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Marcus. Thank you once again so much for being here with us today.
Thanks a lot, Gisela. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thanks to all of you for coming for this nice summer day or spring day to this presentation. Now, I would like to give a little bit of an introduction to the book, but it will just touch upon chapter 1 and 2 a little bit, and then we can actually in the discussion go deeper in various topics. So as you're probably aware of, we live in a world full of shocks. And we have recurring systemic shocks. We just lived or still live through a pandemic shock. We probably will have antibiotic resistance problems. We have experienced 10 years ago a huge financial crisis. We might experience soon some cyber attacks. I'm surprised we haven't experienced them yet. We have natural disasters, and we have lots of uncertainties coming up also with new technologies. And typically when one shock comes, it doesn't come alone. It comes in pairs and triplets and so forth. And my argument is that actually resisting the shocks is futile. And the answer could be to be resilient against them. And before I go into that, I would like to say some words. What is resilience and how does it differ from robustness or just avoiding shocks and risk? How does it connect to resilience? And what type of redundancies does one need? So that's essentially what I would like to add to discussion first. So first, let me start. What is the difference between robustness and resilience from a conceptual level? Robustness is actually withstanding the shock and not moving. Resilience is actually you hit by the shock and then you bounce back. So you don't withstand the shock, you give in first and then you bounce back. So you can think of the oak, which is a very strong tree. If there's some wind coming, the oak doesn't move much. But in contrast, the reed, which moves all the time, and it bounces back and forth all the time. So the oak is a more robust mechanism. The reed is a more resilient mechanism. And what it means is that when you're resilient, you have to be agile and you react to shocks. And there's actually a fable from the 17th century French poet, La Fontaine. And he actually, in that fable and the story, the oak and the reed talk to each other. And the oak is very proud and very strong. But when there's a huge hurricane comes, the oak falls over and the reed stands back up. So even though the oak seems much stronger, at the end of the day, the reed is actually much more resilient. And then the reed talks to the oak at the end, I bend, I bow, but I do not break. And it's also related to the concept of a volatility paradox. What's a volatility paradox? Volatility paradox means something which seems very weak and volatile, like the reed, might ultimately be much stronger because it can bounce back. And it's the ability to bounce back. Whether something is robust or is resilient is also requires different redundancies. So when you hit, you say, oh, you have some extra buffer, some extra redundancies. If you're robust, you need for each particular shock, you need a particular buffer or redundancies. If you're resilient, you need actually fewer redundancies, but you need redundancies you can adjust to the shock. Because you first are hit by the shock, you give in, then you probably take your reserve units, you readjust them based on what the shock is, and then you bounce back. So it has a very different attitude to how to deal with shocks and how to prepare for shocks. And I will argue later on which shocks you might want to be more robust to and which shocks you might want to be more resilient to. So the other thing I would like to contrast it with is just avoiding risk. How is resilience different from avoiding risk? So they probably have taken some classes in risk management, but risk is a static concept. And if I may introduce in academic environment some terms like how would you measure risk with variance, standard deviations, value at risk, or COVAR, which is like the co-value at risk, if you have systemic risk measures. Resilience is a different measure. Resilience is about how quickly do you bounce back. So you have a shock, that's an impulse response curve, and then you bounce back. How quickly can you come back to the initial status or the new normal potentially? And how do you measure this? If you're familiar with stochastic processes, that's about mean reversion, how quickly you come back. Or if you think about other concepts like half-life of a shock. So it's a different concept. It's all about time, how it moves over time. And I would argue that we focus too much on avoiding risk rather than being resilient towards risk. And what's resilient in over time, so a resilient path is like this one where you have a shock and then you turn around and bounce back. And then you have a shock, you turn around, bounce back. So you're very resilient. You come back to the old trend line. Okay, that's risky but resilient. Now, if I want to avoid the risk, I have to give up some expected growth. And this could be GDP, could be your stock portfolio, it could be your well-being, could be many things as moves things over time. Now, of course, you can say, I don't want this recessions where I bounce back from. I go for a riskless path, which is this dashed line here. So there's no risk at all. But you see, in the long run, you would be much better off going for this more risky but resilient path. And you see many economies, which open up and that turn out to be more risky. But if you're resilient, it's fine. Because in the long run, if you wait for the resilient, even after a shock, you're actually better off than being on this dash path. Okay, so that's very important to keep in mind. So you should be open to certain risk as long as the risk you're facing, you have some resilience against it. Now, how can you get resilience, and what's the problem if you don't experience risk? So here's a big problem is that if you kick the can down the road. So here's the same path we had before. That was our resilient path. But now, so let's suppose you take some policy measures by saying, I don't want to experience this recession here. I smooth it out. And actually, then there's another one, you smooth it out, but actually you haven't resolved the issue, just push the problem down the road. And then you have a big recession then later on, and then you can't come back anymore because you have not experienced the earlier downturns. And going through a crisis actually helps you to manage further crises. So when you go through crisis, you actually experience crisis. And that you can see, in the economy, you can see it in business, but you can also see it in human life. So for example, if you grow up in a very sterile environment, so you're not exposed to any bacteria and any virus when you're a little child, then later on, so you will not have, fever early on in life and some other drawbacks. But then you will not be able, and you don't have the ability to manage the further crisis. So your downturn will be much further in the future, and then you don't come back so much. So going through small crises is actually a good thing because you learn how to be resilient. You learn how to react. So resilience is all about not being rigid. It's about being able to react and adjust and modify and going through that. Now, as I said, you want to avoid risk which come with no resilience. And you can take on risk where you can have a resilient path. So what are the resilience killers or the resilience destroyers? Okay. So I look at 3 resilience destroyers. One is our traps. Okay, there are a lot of traps. We have poverty traps, middle income traps, liquidity traps. In economics, we are full of traps, and in life, we're full of traps. So what's a trap? It's like here I have a horizontal line, it's a trap. So if you again, you have to trade off between the dashed line and the resilient shock, what we had before. But now I have put a trap put into place. And if you have a trap, you hit the trap, but then you're stuck. You can't come out. So you can't bounce back. You have no resilience from that anymore. And once you have a trap, you don't want to go for this risky path. You want to go for the dashed line. Okay, so if there's a trap, you want to avoid that. The second resilience destroyers are feedback loops. So that's essentially there's a shock which go from one person, let's say, to another person, and then there's a feedback, and then there's a second feedback, and you get into spirals and things get worse and worse. And these feedback loops can be combined with tipping points. And the tipping point is typically when adverse feedback loops are kicking in. And so here's, again, instead of having a trap, I can have a tipping point. So again, in this case, it's even worse than a trap. I hit the tipping point and then feedback loops kick in and the whole thing goes downhill. Okay, so that's even worse than a trap. So if you think about tipping points, and there are many tipping points all over the place, and they're also very pronounced in environmental issues. Now, if you think about the Gulf Stream stops, you cannot start it again. You hit a tipping point, or the permafrost Antarctica stops, and this you cannot bring it back from it because you hit the tipping point. So tipping points are also very important to watch out for. So if you have traps, feedbacks, and tipping points associated with certain risks, avoid these type of risks. If the risk is not associated with these resilience destroyers, you can go for this risk. So rather than focusing on risk versus non-risk, you should focus on resilience versus non-resilience. Now, there, of course, the tipping point is not so clear that when there's a tipping point, you don't want to go for the resilience. Let me give you a counter example. Here I have a different, there's still my tipping point as before, but now it's like, in climate change examples. If you don't do anything, it seems not risky, we don't do anything, and then at some point we hit the tipping point and then it goes downhill. Now, in this case, going for the resilient but risky path might be a way to avoid the tipping point or to escape the tipping point. So sometimes it's actually useful to have the resilient path in order to avoid tipping points. Of course, this assumes that you know where exactly the tipping point is, and the resilient path will help you to avoid the tipping point. So finally, let me just say one word about resilience and sustainability. You might say, what's the connection between resilience and sustainability? And resilience is actually necessary for sustainability. If something is not resilient, if you hit the tipping point and it goes downhill, then it's not sustainable, but it's not enough. So resilience is one ingredient for sustainability, but you also need no adverse trend. You need both of this in order to have a sustainable situation. So here's, for example, that's a resilient path, but it goes on average, it always goes down. So it's not sustainable. So resilience alone is not sufficient. You need resilience and no adverse trend, so nothing which goes down on average, so that in order to get sustainable development. Now, where does resilience come from? And let me focus on 3 different layers of resilience. So one is resilience as individual, as you as a person. Are you resilient about your personal well-being, your mental health? And there's a huge literature in psychology about this. So I should say resilience comes from material science. We say, oh, you have a certain metal, you shock it, some heat shock, and once the shock goes away, do you bounce back, or does the metal not bounce back? And individual resilience is about, can you bounce back if you face a shock? And how do you make yourself more resilient? What education do you need, and so forth. The book is more about systems and society resilience. For systems, it's about, is a network resilient? Is the electric grid resilient? If there's a shock to part of the grid, does it come back? Is the interbank market resilient? Are global value chains resilient? So it's all about systemic risk. But I think what's most interesting is whether a society is resilient, because it depends on interactions among individuals. And it depends on externalities and responses. So I take the liberty to use some economics a little bit here. And if you're familiar with strategic complementarities, it's even better. But let me just illustrate that. So let's suppose there are 2 people, person A and person B, could be 2 firms. If there's a person A is doing something, acts on something, causes a negative spillover on person B, or some externality, as we're using in economics, then person B suffers. But then it's crucial, well, how does person B react to that? If person B reacts the same way and does the same thing, and it causes then a spill back to person A, and then person A will do even more, and then it causes another spillover to person B, and so forth, and the whole thing spirals out of control. And I call this feedback externalities because you combine externalities with feedbacks. And these are the dangerous things, because they make the externality bigger and bigger. So what are examples? So for example, if, in times of COVID crisis, it's a very trivial example. If I start buying toilet paper, there will be less toilet paper for the others. The others will start toilet paper too. And then there will be, for me, less toilet paper. I start to buy even more toilet paper. And at the end of the day, we all was off because everybody is just hoarding toilet paper. That's just a trivial example. But economics and society is full of these feedback externalities. And we have to design society in such a way to avoid that we have a lot of these feedback externalities. Now, more generally, the way we model or we have this is we have a social contract. So how we live together, we live based on a social contract together. And this is a huge traditional political science. I give a very economic externality interpretation to it. So of course, it goes back to Thomas Hobbes, to John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. But in general, the way the economic interpretation is, a social contract is there to limit externalities. So the externalities others cause on me, and the externalities I cause on others, negative externalities. But there are also other externalities which come from Mother Nature, and we call them shocks. So there's a shock. It's essentially as much as Mother Nature is causing externality on us. And the way we can deal with that, I can do ex ante some investment to minimize the impact of the shocks by being more resilient. That's one way to do it. Or we can also help each other out. Okay, so how can we help each other out? We can help each other out that we become each other more resilient. Whoever will be shocked, we don't know yet who is shocked, but we help each other out. So for example, we don't know who will be unemployed at some point, but then we have some reskilling and help each other out. Or we can also provide some insurance in form of compensating the losses with extra dollars. Resilience is more about helping people to get back on their feet. It's more like the reskilling rather than compensating you with dollars. And then is the question, what society do we want, and what society is more able to help each other out? And one dimension you can think of is the society very diverse or very homogeneous? So if society is very homogeneous, it's actually, people are more willing to help each other out. If the society is very heterogeneous, people are more able to help each other out. And if you've done some finance, you probably have distinguished between idiosyncratic risk and systematic risk. Or but the intuition is the following: there's a shock coming from outside. If you're all the same, we all shock the same way. So there's no way we can diversify or share our risk because we all face the same shock. So if we're very homogeneous, we can't really insure each other or provide this resilient support because we all hit the same way. If you have a country with only one mega industry because the whole country depends on tourism, tourism shock, it just hits all of us. Now, if you have a very heterogeneous society or heterogeneous industries, but also heterogeneous people, then there's a shock coming and it hits some people more and other people less, and some might be even benefiting from that. So ex ante, we can have a social contract saying, oh, whenever we are hit by a shock, and some people will be very badly hit and others will have even a positive shock, they can help each other out. And this way, a more heterogeneous society, a more diverse society actually can better insure each other. But we know also from the research of Alberto Alesina and others that people are less willing. If they're more diverse, they're less willing to help each other out. So even though they're more able to help each other out, they're less willing to do it. So there's an optimal mix between two to take the ability and the willingness into account to help each other out. How do we do that? Of course, we can do this through government interventions, or we can also do this with the right market structure. We have an insurance market structure. But most of it, and that's what the economists underemphasize, the important thing are social norms. So, and you have to find the optimal point between these three elements, how to implement the social contract. And every country will have a different emphasis on that. And let me just, for the COVID crisis, compare Japan with Germany. And in the COVID crisis, in Japan, the social norms are very pronounced. So the government doesn't have to intervene because social norms are so powerful to make sure that there are no externalities imposed on others. And you could see that if you plot the number of COVID cases in Germany and the stringency index of the measures Germany imposed versus the Japanese ones. So even though Japan had a much lower, less stringent COVID measures, they had a much lower incidence of COVID cases. Okay, so because people wear face masks anyway. If you don't wear it, your neighbor will tell you or will look badly at you. So the social pressure is large, and is very large for that. Now, what I do is I use this concept of resilience and this robustness, and I go through many, many areas of policy areas. So that's what the book is all about. Let's understand this resilience. Once you see resilience, you see it everywhere. And you understand this differently in a way. And there's different examples. So one is health policies, how, in the COVID crisis in particular. Another examples are macroeconomic policies. In particular, the phenomenon that we have a very low interest rates. The low interest rates give you more fiscal space because the government can go into debt with a much lower interest rates, or there's more room to help people and do stimulus packages. But it also means you have less room in the monetary space, so you have less resilience on the monetary. Central banks can do less. Now, there's also a huge area in finance where there's resilience. And if you think about it, what resilience is, what you want, a company is hit by a shock, it wants to come back. If a company is highly indebted or has the so-called debt overhang problem, it cannot invest, it cannot grow, it will become a zombie firm and just grows, doesn't grow anymore, and it just stays there and takes resources out of the society. So what you want, if firms or even people are overly indebted, you would like some efficient debt restructuring. So limited liability or efficient debt restructuring, good bankruptcy law helps to restructure things, to restart things and bounce back more quickly. And we can come back more generally to the reed and the oak. And here's a little bit of, probably you've seen this in some of your lectures. If I just on the x-axis, I say, okay, what is the tax revenue for a country? And this is a debt, let's say, of a country, but it can also be a company. That's like, what's the cash flow of the company on the x-axis? And it's risky, it moves, we don't know where it will be. If you have a debt contract, it offers you $100 million all the time, except if the cash flow is very low or the tax revenue is very low, then the company goes bankrupt and you face a bankruptcy cost on top of it. That's why there's a step function down here. So the debt seems very strong, like the oak. It doesn't move at all. So if you get news and the fundamentals move around, the debt will always stay 100 million. So it's like the oak, except if you hit the tipping point and the company goes bankrupt or the country goes bankrupt, then you have some bankruptcy costs and all this. And you might also even have runs on the debt. That's like the oak. The equity is a little bit like the reed. If you have an equity contract or if you have some shares of a company, as the fundamentals change, the shares and the fundamentals change all the time. So it seems very volatile, but as a structure for the whole society, you don't have this tipping point. It moves around all the time, but it makes the whole society, equity finance society, seems actually ultimately more robust. So you can contrast the resilience also and connect it to equity and debt as well. Now, I mentioned some other concepts. There's a whole chapter on inequality. And you can think about income inequality, about wealth inequality. I introduced this concept of resilience inequality, which is, think of two people, they're equally wealthy, they equally have the same income right now, but person A can bounce back and person B cannot bounce back. What does this mean? Person A knows he can bounce back, he can take some opportunities person B is afraid to take, and hence taking this opportunity, he will get higher income down the road, so it leads to income inequality, and then ultimately if he has more income, it also leads to more wealth inequality. So the fundamental source of the problem is the difference in resilience. Person A can take on some opportunities and take on some risk because he knows he will bounce back from it, person B cannot. Now, if you go to emerging economies, that's really what really poverty trap is. A poverty trap means you cannot take on a risk because you know when you get shocked by a negative shock, you can't bounce back from it. That's what essentially a poverty trap is. Middle income trap is about whole countries, they grow, they catch up with the advanced economies, they catch up with the US until a certain level, and then they're stuck. That's the middle income trap. Then they cannot catch up further because catching up with the advanced economy is very much just copying things. But once you want to come to the frontier, you have to also invest in R&D, and that's a very different societal structure, different economy. And the transition from catching up to being on the frontier is very difficult for many industries. Then there's a whole chapter on the international macrofinance. What's the role of flexible exchange rates? What's the global role of the dollar? How important is the dollar? And then there's a whole element on international trade, global value chains. We move from a just-in-time production function, we minimize any inventories. We will now move to much more just in case. So you have some more inventories just in case if something goes wrong. And you would probably introduce some stress tests for global value chains to make sure that, like we did for banks after the great financial crisis, we introduced stress tests for the banks. Now we would like to introduce stress tests for global value chains. And then there's the question, how do you deal with this with outsourcing? Should we bring all the production back to the US? It's called reshoring. Or should we have a different global structure where we, instead of outsourcing to one country, everything comes from China, we have outsourced from different continents. So there's one company from China supplying some input, another one in Africa, and another third one in Latin America, let's say. And this way we get resilience by outsourcing to multiple countries across different continents, let's say. And then there's a whole element of the book on the global geopolitics and also the climate change. And I touched already on sustainability, how sustainability is related to resilience, or resilience is a critical input to sustainability. But then there's a whole element to climate change, which, as I mentioned initially, there's a lot of effects, particularly with tipping points, you have to be aware of. So let me stop here. I know I ran over time already, and we open up for discussion.
Yeah, no, not at all. Thank you so much. So you've covered actually many of the things I was going to touch upon in questions, but maybe we'll get onto a couple of things a little more deeply. So you're absolutely right when you say that once you read the book, everything looks like it's about resilience. And so I like the example of existing institutions like bankruptcy protection and limited liability, and how all of those enable people to bounce back from adverse shocks. But I was thinking in light of the experience of the pandemic, and with thinking ahead to future crises, do you believe that the current system that we have in the US and around the world, that it is resilient, or are you advocating that we do major things to make our system more resilient?
Yeah, I would say, different countries have different forms of resilience, and the OECD actually ranks countries, which country is more resilient. And the US ranks fairly highly because the US is very flexible and agile. It's not so good in handling the shocks immediately. So US was very hard hit by COVID, but then it, through the invention of vaccines and all this, got out of this fairly quickly. So that's one important component. What in some European countries are superior in a sense that there's more cohesion into society. So in order to help each other out, that's more easily done, or the social contract is more pronounced. In this way, they can handle some shocks better this way. They might be less agile, less flexible in reacting to shocks. That's where the US is very strong. That's where some European countries are weaker. But in terms of social cohesion, Europe is stronger. And that's actually a big challenge, in particular in the recent events. So if the country gets more and more polarized, that actually undermines resilience in the United States as well. The second element of your question was, what is the global resilience? And I think we need more global goods. So we don't have a global governance structure in order to really have some good global goods, global public goods. And resilience is a global public good. So if you have a very resilient global society, everybody will benefit, but nobody wants to provide the input because it's costly to provide this input, but ultimately everybody will benefit. And we saw this in the COVID crisis. We didn't have the information system. Of course, we have the WHO, and that helped us, but we need more of support on the global level. And that's what we still have to work on.
That was actually one of my questions on the global thing, that the pandemic was a global crisis, yet there was no global response, with the maybe possible exception of COVAX. And countries preferred to go it alone, or they were doing things on a bilateral basis. So thinking again ahead to the next crisis, what can we do with multilateral institutions to enhance their resilience, so that the response to future crises, whether it's a financial crisis or whether it's climate change, whatever it is, that cyber attacks, that the response is more resilient?
Yeah, I think it's two, as you rightly pointed out, there are certain global institutions. I think they have to be equivalently better equipped with funds. And to the extent they have funds, they're not really willing to lever up the expenditures in order to step in on the crisis. So there has to be more willingness to really lever up the balance sheet in order to overcome current shocks. And we have to work on to make it more pronounced and give some additional elements at the global scale. The second element is that typically it works well if there's a benevolent hegemon who is very much taking some leading role. And the hegemon benefits from many of the global connections and all this, but he's also chipping in times of crisis. And when I, for example, think about the IMF or the World Bank or the WHO and so forth, I think all of these institutions are very, very important. But there's also, in particular, if you think about the financial situation, that the US Federal Reserve was providing swap lines, and I described this in the book. It was extremely important not to have another financial crisis in March 2020. So we were very close to have a huge economic meltdown, but it was because the Fed cut the interest rates, the Fed extended swap lines, which means you extend funding to many other central banks. So everybody was short on dollars. Everybody wanted to get dollars, and essentially the Fed was lending back the dollars through the swap lines to the international central banks, which then lended up to their own private banks. And this was very, very important. So it's both. We need the global institutions, but we need a hegemon, a benevolent hegemon who has the global order in mind. So both of these elements are very, very important to hold everything essentially together.
So let me just follow up on that. So you say some interesting things about the global financial architecture. And so just following up on that point, I think the current system is so much under stress because of the US-China rivalry, because of innovations like digital currencies, and also the use of financial instruments for political and security ends. So in light of that, how should we go about constructing a resilient global financial architecture for the future?
Yeah, so there are certain things which I favor, which is, you can design an architecture which does not require some political interventions. So it's like self-governing. And then there's some other elements of the global architecture where you really have to intervene. You have to meet together and come to an agreement and make so it's actually better to come to a system which is automatic. So whenever there's a shock, it automatically leads this way. So what I do in the book, I propose some global financial architecture, which would be self-governing. So it would automatically stabilize the system. So you don't have to intervene. For other problems, you probably need a situation or some element where, it is the case that you have to come together, come to a committee, and then make decisions. And the problem is, of course, if you have these international organizations, to find the right governance structure. So we have to improve the governance structure to make sure that they can't block each other. So in particular, if you have this big rivalries as we are coming up between US and China, it should not be the case that we can block each other. And it should also be the case in the areas we agree upon, we move forward, and the areas which we can't agree on, we can put it aside. So, but it shouldn't be the case that the areas we can't agree upon will also destroy policy areas which we in theory could agree upon. So we have to somehow separate that. So ideally, you would organize institutions which are separate. So one institution is still working very well, even though the other one is not working so well because we can't agree on certain issues. And we have all these global problems, particularly climate change and other things, which we really have to work together in order to solve.
So maybe I'll ask one other question. So again, one thing that I found really interesting is how you mentioned that economic upheavals brought about by crises can actually serve a useful function. So they aid with the process of creative destruction. So some businesses shut down and new businesses are formed and society's resources are better deployed. But is it possible that government policies that are intended to help people bounce back, such as support to firms in a crisis, that they could backfire by interfering with this process of creative destruction? And if so, how do you go about striking the right balance?
Yeah, there are two questions, and they're all very important. One is that if you go through crisis, it actually helps you to manage further crises down the road. So the fact that we went through the global financial crisis, we developed the swap lines and all these things, and it helped us in March 2020 to overcome the next crisis. So that's essentially helpful. Or countries which went through the SARS crisis were much better in handling the COVID crisis because they had experienced some of that. So going through smaller crises actually makes you better in managing or being more resilient down the road. And the second element is what economists refer to moral hazard. So if you help out too much, then the mechanisms are not working anymore to really make the necessary reforms because you just help out. Or in particular, if you look in 2020 or 2021, if you look at the number of bankruptcies went down, especially in many, many countries, because bankruptcy was not possible anymore. So we have a lot of firms which should have gone bankrupt. In a healthy system, it's always the case that the firms which are less productive should go bankrupt in order to free up resources for firms which are more productive. So that's the ideal economic order in a sense. And this way you reallocate the resources to the firms which are more productive. Now, because of COVID, we didn't know the selection was not working anymore. So we just put stimulus money in and just to make survive all the firms. So we didn't have the selective selection process anymore. And it might be going now, going further when the interest rate goes up, we will have a shakeup in many, many industries because we didn't have the ongoing shakeup all the time. And that might, create some hiccups, and we might have to be prepared if there's some difficulties coming up on us. But that's essentially, but I'm arguing this was the right thing to do given the circumstances, but it has some long-lasting effects.
So I'll ask my last question, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. I was wondering what do you think about political polarization, and especially, COVID was something that divided this country like a few other things. So political polarization, eroding trust in governments, lack of trust in experts and expertise. How do these things affect a society's resilience? And I guess the hard question, I don't know if it's even fair to ask, is what should be done about that?
That's a tough one. But I come back to something I said earlier, is that the fabric of society, social contract is key, because if there is a good social contract, we can help each other out. And this way we become all more resilient. So we can invest in our own individual resilience to make sure that I can bounce back more easily and you can bounce back more easily. But we can also work together, and we don't know yet who will be hit by a shock, who will get cancer or whatever. Then we have a social structure and a social contract which helps us to out. And this only works if society is not too polarized. If you make society becomes too polarized, the willingness to really have this social contract active is actually going away. And that's why we have to watch out to make sure that there's a common identity, so we can identify with common objectives and aims, and we can all hold together and help each other out. So I saw this, for example, in India in March and April 21, where the Delta variant of the COVID came. It was a huge hit, but the society grew together and helped each other out, and that's what we need. And that's also very important to have this, and this only works if society is sufficiently or not polarized. So the key question is how to make sure the society is not so polarized. I think sometimes it helps to have some common aims. So if you just, sometimes it can be just a certain sports event. So if you think about a talk in the book, Nelson Mandela, he had inherited a country which was very polarized through apartheid. And so he used the Rugby World Cup, which was held in South Africa, to bring the country together. So having sport events and just cheering for the same team can be a helpful thing. So there are many, many things politicians can do in order to make people hold together. But it's of course challenging. You have to be creative. This is just one small example. But there has to be a sense of a common aim, a common identity, and you can foster this by taking the right measures and being a forward-looking, wise policeman like Nelson Mandela was.
Great, thank you. And I don't want to impinge on the audience's time, so we'll open it up for questions from the audience.
Thanks. Any questions here? You can just come to the front.
Come to the front, to the mic here.
Hello, hi, okay, cool.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Callum, and thanks for joining us. You talked about like the different dimensions of resilience, the individual system and society, but the society one was based on the interactions between individuals and their responses, like the externalities. And I was just kind of wondering, how do then the country's negative externalities impact the resilience of other countries in the global market?
That's a very good point. I mean, the same reasoning applies from country to country. So what I said, person A, person B, it could also be country A, country B. So there could also be that, country A is polluting, that causes a negative externality on country B. And then the response of country B could be, oh, if they're polluting, it doesn't help us, we will pollute as well. And then, it goes back to country B and you get in a negative spiral. And the hope is to actually not to get this reaction that, oh, we can pollute as well. Our pollution makes no difference. but to come, then country B experiences externality and says, okay, we innovate in alternative energies and hugely step our R&D expenditures. And then actually the country B will cause a positive externality to country A, because the country A can then adopt this new technology as well. So it depends. The externalities are always, if they're negative, they're bad. If they're positive, they're good. But it just depends. Sometimes some clever reaction where the country says, okay, I take a little bit this into account and I go for innovation. And that's essentially, if you think about coming back to climate change, because this, if you think across countries, that's one of the big issues in these negative externalities. If some countries move ahead and say, okay, we want to be industrial leaders in these renewable technologies, then actually they can actually change the world. So just to give you an example, as you probably hear from my accent, I'm from Germany originally. Germany is polluting about 2-3% of global CO2. If Germany said we go carbon neutral within the next 3 years, it wouldn't make any difference because China will just undo it. So what Germany could do is essentially say, we become a technological leader in developing new technologies. And then hopefully this new technology will be so productive that it will crowd out the dirty technology, because it's actually cheaper to use this new technology. And other countries just adopt it. And this way, a country can make a way bigger contribution to the problem, the global problem of climate change, than it just saying, okay, we go carbon neutral within a short time period. So it's more like going through the technology route. I don't know, I went probably too far to your question.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so our next question comes from Dr. Ritu Agarwal, the Senior Associate Dean of Faculty and Research here at the Smith School. She asks, to build a resilient economy and society, planners and policymakers need to allow some economic pain to play out. Do you have any thoughts on how to accomplish this when politicians are largely focused on the next election?
Yes, that's a very important point. So I would say two things. It is indeed true that you have to convince people to go through some valley and some economic pain, as Professor Agarwal pointed out. But it might be easier to go for a resilient strategy than for a robustness strategy. So it's all about persuading other people to go with you. So let me give you an example. So let's suppose you follow a strategy where you really put a lot of resources there, you sacrifice future growth just to make sure that you can handle any shock. Then people will not see the shock at all. They might not be even convinced there was ever a threat, because you don't see anything. Now, if you went for a resilience strategy, then you would say, I have some reserve units, some redundancies, which I can employ flexibly, but when the shock comes, we will be hit. And then I will be the hero when we can bounce back. So for policymakers, it's actually easier to communicate a resilience strategy than a robustness strategy. And that's really important for risk managers, or in general. Risk managers have not much influence in financial companies or any company, because they're only the bad guys. They just impose certain restrictions and they say, oh, you always say that. So if you follow for a resilience strategy, it's actually easier to communicate to the public or to the others, because you see the shock and then you bounce back. And then so you should put the resources there. So it might be easier to follow a resilience strategy, but I agree, there has to be some economic pain, and you have to make sure you can get the curve early enough that you don't fall off beyond some tipping point. And that's the key thing, to avoid these tipping points or some traps. But as long as you can bounce back and you can keep your position, essentially, then you will be seen, oh, wow, he actually helped us to bounce back. And this might be easier to communicate. If I go very specifically, so if you look, perhaps I shouldn't use too many German examples, but if you look at the number of death cases in Germany in 2020, and you look at the band, what's the worst number and the lowest number of death cases in the last 5 years, the numbers in 2020 were not outside of this range. So many people said, oh, look, there's not a big problem with COVID because the number of deaths are not going up compared to the previous years. And what people have a hard time to understand, the number of deaths didn't go up because of all the lockdown. they don't understand counterfactuals. It's very hard to communicate counterfactuals. So that if we didn't had a lockdown, the number of dead people would go up significantly. And it was very hard to communicate that. And only in the fall and the winter of 2020, then actually the number of deaths went up significantly. So that's why it's not obvious, because it's difficult to communicate a counterfactual. It's sometimes easier to go for a resilience strategy rather than this robustness or risk avoidance strategy.
Yes, go ahead, go to the mic.
Hi there. Thanks so much for the presentation so far. I was just curious what your thoughts are about just the government structure and how that plays into a country's ability to be resilient. For example, we saw in China when the COVID cases went up, the government was able to mandate lockdowns and basically give fines, give penalties for people who would come out of their residence. Obviously, we couldn't do that in the US. We had a lot more freedoms here. So I'm just curious whether what the relationship you think is between just the government's political structure, the governance, versus how well or how resilient they can be.
Yeah, so I have a slide, but it's more political conjecture. I didn't put it in the book. I would argue that an open society is more resilient than an autocratic society. And why is that? Because in an open society, the information flow is much easier. So you see, the COVID crisis started in China to some extent because information flow was not happening. And so the lower authority levels were afraid to tell the upper authority levels, and then the intervention occurred too late. And then the information was not passed on to WHO early enough and so forth. So if you have an open society and criticism coming up all the time, the information flow is faster. But in order to control, often to make drastic measures and adjust very radically, autocratic society has a stronger step and can actually step on the brakes much more radically compared to an open society. But in general, I would argue an autocratic society is a little bit more like, it's very rigid. It's more like an oak. You know, it stands rigidly there, very stable, and seems very sound until the hurricane comes, and then it falls over and can't step up. And you see it in particular when there's a transition of power. You know, typically when the leader is dying or something, the transition of power is always, or it's there's a revolution or there's some coup, and that's always very, difficult to handle. While in an open society, the transitions of power are more easily, it seems more volatile. It's like the reed, constantly moving around, and that's what makes it then looks very weak, but ultimately it's not so weak because there's the pressure is constantly going away. It's not building up the pressure, it's going away, and that actually helps up. But that's a conjecture at this stage. I don't, I'm aware that there are also examples, where democracies have downfalls and so forth. So that's also the case. But in general, I would say an open society is more resilient than an autocratic society. Then I want to go one step further because it's a very interesting question. There's, if you know Hayek, he's probably the second most famous economist after Keynes. He talked about spontaneous orders. The spontaneous orders are orders which are not designed from top down, but they come from bottom up. So if you think about languages, the language we're using, nobody has designed our language. It came from society bottom up. So we have, of course, we have other languages like Esperanto, which were designed by central authority or not by some people, but they were not adopted. But most languages come, and I would argue that the spontaneous orders or self-organizing systems, which come from the bottom up, they are more resilient than structures which are designed from top down. And the reason is that they're designed through evolution. They'll go through many shocks over over time, and this way they become more resilient compared to when something is designed by humans. It's more, we want to make everything symmetric and very simple and elegant and things like that, and that makes it less resilient compared to a structure which is more designed essentially by evolution over a longer time period.
One last question via Zoom, and then if we have any last questions from the audience here. He asks, I'm sorry, what an international organization can do to contribute to being a resilient society?
So I think so I'm contradicting myself a little bit. Of course, the way international organizations are designed can make the whole global society more resilient. And as the earlier question came, you have this resilience, not only from person A to person B, but from country A to country B. And then if you create then for country B the incentives that it will react in a particular way in order to destroy these feedback loops, that can often be designed the way that the reaction function is going this way or the other way. And so one is for an education, international education, is to make students and future leaders aware of resilience and what are the resilience killers. So in particular, teach these resilience killers or destroyers and what one has to look out for, but don't be afraid from taking any risk, in particular if you can bounce back from this risk and learn how to bounce back from this risk. I think that's very important. The other thing is, then through the people you educate, you bring them into international institutions and help them and guide them to take the right measures to make the whole global architecture to be more resilient, and that each institution contributes that bounces back. So if you have, for example, poverty traps, so you recognize the certain resilience elements, you work on them. So you put all the energy on this rather than wasting energy on some other things where it's less related to the resilient elements.
Question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Marcus. My name is Carlos. Thank you so much for coming today. I just had a quick question. When I was trying to wrap my head around your different frameworks around resilient risk avoidance and the idea of kicking the can down the road, my mind went straight to the gas problem that we're facing in the US right now. And the idea that a lot of our approach has been around the idea of kicking the can down the road. You can see it, a few weeks ago, we made an adjustment to the tax on gas to make it a little bit more, I guess, allowable. It makes it so people around the world, or at least around the country, can actually afford it. And then just as today, Joe Biden released a statement saying that he wanted to drop or increase the ethanol percentage in gas, which usually only occurs start of summer and July 1st. So I guess my question around that is, how do you balance being resilient when it comes to an extremely inelastic good like gas?
Yeah, so gas right now is the way you want to do it. You don't want to necessarily lower the gas. So the different elements. If you lower the gas price, people will not cut back the consumption on gas. But right now you want them to cut it back on consumption because we don't have enough gas. First for geopolitical reasons, but also in the long run for environmental reasons. So rather than lowering the gas price, you want to compensate people by saying, okay, you have spent so much on gas in the last year. I know the gas price is so high, I give you lump sum, a certain compensation. I know it will be social hardship for you. So that's what economic theory will teach you. And of course, it's more difficult to implement to say, okay, if you don't know really who is consuming much gas and he gets then more compensation than others, then there will be some equity issues and people think that's not fair, only because he was using so much gas last year, gets a bigger stimulus check than I get. So there's some political constraints on this one has to take into account as well. And that's what drives policymakers to a large extent. But in theory, you should not lower gas price. You should actually keep it up and make sure that people consume less gas. There's another element to this ethanol and biofuel in particular. Let's move to biofuel, which is, we have shortage on gas, but we also have shortage on food. And the shortage on food is a much more severe problem. So we will have, because Russia is one of the, in terms of wheat and barley, one of the biggest exporters, and that's going down. And also Ukraine is the fourth biggest exporter on wheat. And last time, when we had some shortage on wheat, there's social uprising in Africa. So Egypt will suffer right away. There's huge suffering. There will probably be some starvation going on. So right now, it's planting season and you will see it in 6 months. And the question now is, should we really use the food to make some energy out of it, or should we rather keep it food and then feed the poorer nations to make sure that there are no social tensions building up in many of the African countries because there's a shortage on food or the food prices are exploding and people cannot feed their children anymore. And for this, I would actually, at this stage, I would say, let's not use, at least for this season, or for 1 year at least, let's not use any of this for energy to drive cars. We need the food for other things. We might even cut back on meat consumption because non-meat consumption is much more efficient way to feed people. And that there's a big challenges essentially at this stage. And resilience means you have to change your mindset. So if there's a new shock coming, like the shock through the Russian invasion, we have to modify our policy and react to that. Then you're more resilient. If you just try to plow ahead the same way as before, then it doesn't work. And of course, more generally, we have to, the green transition, we have to speed it up even further. And in this sense, the Russian shock is actually speeding up the whole transition process, but it creates some, hardship for many people in the short term.
Thank you.
Well, let me first thank you, Marcus, for being here with us, and thank you for writing this book. I'll send it back to Marina to close out the session. Thank you.
I also want to thank you on behalf of the center, Marcus, for joining us via Zoom. Your high-tech presentation behind you is something that we'll have to aspire to for future presentations. But thank you for joining us, and also for providing us your expertise on this really interesting subject. And I want to thank everybody here for your questions and those via Zoom. If you need to scan for your credit for your course, please go ahead and do so on the screen here. And if you have a chance, please fill out the evaluation that you have. And for those on Zoom, you'll get that as it pops up after you close out of the event. And I hope you would join us on June 3rd. We'll have our next event called Maryland Business Adapt. So we'll be celebrating the resilience of Maryland business during being able to kind of fight through COVID. So thank you so much.
I thank you, and thanks to all of you. Thanks for organizing it, and thanks to everybody for coming and for the nice questions. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Marcus, we'll follow up separately after the event.
Great. Thanks a lot for organizing.
Thank you so much.
It was a lot of work to put the hyper things together. Very well done. Thank you.